Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. And I'm sorry to stop conversations. The best part of these lunches are, frankly, oftentimes everybody getting together and talking. But thank you all very much for coming today to the 2019 Madeleine K. Albright Luncheon. This is my first such Albright Luncheon, and I can see why it is such a special event every year. As I begin my 9th month as president of NDI, I am more convinced than ever that the promotion of women's political empowerment must be at the center of our democracy agenda. In about a month's time, NDI's Gender, Women, and Democracy team will participate in the triennial Women Deliver Conference in Vancouver. Its theme is Power, Progress, Change. This is indeed a moment to reflect on the global movement for gender equality and women's empowerment. This is a movement that reaches across oceans and time zones to harness the power of partnership, of diverse voices, and of women's lived experiences to promote social justice, equitable growth, and sustainable peace for us all. It requires women and men to be risk takers for women's empowerment, not just as a one-off sign-up to a letter or pledge, but as part of our daily lives. We must all, everyone, be mindful of and take action to combat gender inequality in all its forms, both obvious and insidious. And before lunch, you heard from 3 of the most powerful examples of women risk takers in the United States. 2 freshman congresswomen and a future president of the United States. That was an amazing, amazing speech. And in the process, saw what I hope will be the future of American politics in the years to come. Strong women who bring a fresh, vital, and results-oriented sensibility to the profound challenges we face as a country and as a democracy. I am inspired by the future that they represent. But today, we celebrate and honor women not only in the United States, but around the world who have taken risks for equality and justice for their countries. There is no greater example of such a person than Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, who is with us today. Ms. Klympush-Tsintsadze is the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. She is also responsible for implementation of gender equality policy in Ukraine. As you all know, this is an especially critical period in Ukraine's history. Ukraine has made significant democratic progress since the landmark Euromaidan demonstrations of 2014. Ukraine just 2 weeks ago had its second presidential election since those demonstrations. NDI led an international mission to observe those elections and concluded that the election was credible and reflected the will of the voters, which constituted an important step forward for Ukraine. But the country's gains are at risk from opponents of reform, both at home and across Ukraine's borders. Ukraine faces profound economic and social challenges, and of course, a severe military challenge from its eastern neighbor. That includes not only in the physical space, in fact, but in cyberspace. In fact, one of the major targets of Kremlin information attacks on Ukraine, as part of its overall assault on Western values, is women's empowerment, gender equality. In Ukraine, as elsewhere, shadowy forces on the internet have sought to sow division and disinformation based on gender in order to divide and inflame citizens. In the United States, we all well know how that goes. The lesson from this is that supporting those who advocate on behalf of women's rights is one of the best ways to counter disinformation assaults against democracy by those who wish us ill. So now is not the time to avert our attention from Ukraine, given the threat the Ukrainian people face from within and without. Now is the time, instead, to pay attention to those who continue to fight on the front lines against that threat. In her role as Deputy Prime Minister, Ms. Klympush-Tsintsadze has been such a steadfast fighter as well as risk taker. She has been at the forefront of efforts to unify diverse Ukrainian political actors to ensure its Euro-Atlantic path stays on track, and she has also taken the lead to unite advocates for gender equality throughout Ukraine's government and society. In fact, Ukraine's first ever national survey on gender equality, which was conducted by NDI and released by the Deputy Prime Minister's office, revealed that both women and men indeed want to see change in their country when it comes to gender roles. and the Deputy Prime Minister took little time to embrace those results. As a result, under her leadership, a list of 450 professions banned for women in Ukraine became open to them. Women gained the opportunity to study in military educational institutions and to serve in the Ukrainian armed forces. Under her supervision, several new major initiatives were launched by her government to prevent combat domestic violence and ensure equal rights and opportunity between men and women. So for the first time in Ukraine's history, gender equality became one of the government's top priorities. NDI has been proud to work alongside Deputy Prime Minister Klympush-Tsintsadze on these efforts, and we are terrifically fortunate to have her with us this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Deputy Prime Minister Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, a true hero and risk taker for women's empowerment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mitchell, for such a warm welcome and such a explicit understanding and giving explicit understanding to everybody what Ukraine is today and what we are going through. I am absolutely privileged and touched and honored to speak to this wonderful audience. And obviously, you might only guess, but I'm also nervous to address this very distinguished audience. We probably can say that today we are entering a very special and important moment, at which some are calling the new age of women. And I believe that Ukraine is right now not exception in this general tendency, because in Ukraine, the movement for gender equality also got a very powerful impulse exactly after and during and then after Revolution of Dignity, because it did lead afterwards to the mentality change in the Ukrainian society. And by now, I am sure that Ukraine can actually play a exemplary role for other nations in reaching some of the standards or some of the wonderful openings that gender equality leads us to. Because back in 2013, men and women in Ukraine have come out in the streets fighting, standing up for a better life of the country, making sure that Ukraine is becoming a better nation. And that was about democratic freedoms, and that was about a rule of law, and that was about human rights and equality. And when then the attack from Russian Federation has come, when the war broke out, women along with men have actually joined the volunteer movement, and they also have joined the armed forces in order to go and fight for Ukraine's independence, fight for Ukraine's democracy, and for Ukraine's freedom. We believe back home that true democracy is actually impossible without equal opportunities for women and men in the society. And it is impossible without engaging and empowering women. And in the last 5 years, we have gone through a remarkable transition to pursue the democratic and prosperous society. And these changes that we are going through, it's not about only exclusively changing rules and procedures, but it's about cultural change, it's about mentality change. And one of the core elements of this mentality change and this shift is destruction of gender-based stereotypes in the Ukrainian society. I am very proud to say that, yes, Ukrainian government, for the first time in its history of 28 years, has gender equality among its top priorities. And I'm happy to have this opportunity to be the leader, coordinator of all of those efforts of the Ukrainian government. And you know, I would tell you the truth, it's not an easy task. It's not that you always have the support of all of your colleagues in the government, or you have always the support of your colleagues in the parliament. You know, some are saying, why now? There is no discrimination against women in Ukraine. Well, we have much more urgent things to address. You know, we have a war going on, so equal rights and opportunities for men and women are not necessarily on the top of our agenda. But I'm happy that with engagement of my colleagues, like-minded colleagues in the government, with engagement of my colleagues from the civil society, from the parliament, from the Equal Opportunities Caucus in the parliament, and with engagement of international organizations, including NDI, which I'm very grateful for. We have actually managed to pursue that, this important part of the reform agenda in Ukraine should be prioritized for the Ukrainian government. And my reasoning is absolutely simple. Women's participation in tackling modern challenges, both in political and economic life, is critical component of our success. And I'm happy to tell you that, yes, we have changed the situation. You've heard about number of professions that we've opened up for women. We are very proud to say that today we've opened up the positions for the in the armed forces, that Ukrainian female and male officers and soldiers are serving on the same basis. We have about 10.6% of women serving in the Ukrainian armed forces, which is very close to NATO average, and NATO is one of the institutions that we are aspiring to become members of. We are very happy to see that women are widely represented among state border guards. There we have 24% of women, among police 17% of women, and all these numbers are growing as we are taking off the discriminatory legal provisions that have been impeding their way to this success in different security and defense institutions. Well, so far in Ukraine's government, probably the women's numbers and representation is still unassuming, but we are spearheading a very important areas. It's healthcare, it's education, it's veteran affairs, it is finance, and it is European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And obviously, I am very proud of all those women from Ukraine that are working as diplomats, as negotiators in our common effort to actually work relentlessly to counter Russian aggression. Being among one of the most female nations, having more than 54% of population being women, we actually have the largest so far that we ever had, but still very little representation in the parliament. We have 12% of women working in the parliament. But if you ask how many women do you have in the parliament, do you think we have in the parliament, most of people say more than 30%, which for me means that all of us are working much harder, much more in order to make ourselves visible, in order to actually ensure that those who are coming after us, they know that the professionalism, the patriotism, the integrity of all those women who have served before them is actually paving the way for the others. As it was mentioned, this National Democratic Institute's poll that was held at the request of my office actually indicated that 61% of Ukrainians would like to see more balanced representation of men and women in the Ukrainian, among the Ukrainian authorities. So I believe we are just driving and corresponding to the social demand. However, not everything is so bright. And let me just mention several things. As these efforts to achieve higher representation and equality, as we consolidated our efforts, we have actually seen more and more pushback from different forces. And we have seen manipulation with gender terms and with values, and that has actually been very often connected with the Russian disinformation campaign, which devised to hold Ukraine's Western course. Today, it is as important, hence not always visible, component of Russian hybrid war. We do see these anti-gender campaigns have been directly engineered from the Kremlin, but at the same time, we also see a lot of Ukrainian politicians who are trying to take this as a possibility to use for themselves as their political platform. Their message is very simple, that the West promotes gender to undermine traditional family values, to destroy Ukrainian families, and furthermore, to destroy Ukrainian society. Obviously, we understand that this is far from being the truth, but we have to fight with these prejudices. We do have to fight with these stereotypes. And we are seeing all the risks and challenges in advocating gender equality in the society, which still has a very high level of conservatism. And also, there is lack of still basic knowledge and competence in gender equality among political leaders, among media, among academia. So for us, further empowering women is a very important tool to ensure, to explain that actually more equality, more gender equality will only make our families stronger and healthier. So my commitment is absolutely clear. I'm really going to double my efforts in preventing and responding to these anti-gender activities, as well as minimize the risks for all those gender equality activists when they see the pushback that we are seeing from some of the political forces. And in this regard, I hope for the support from our partners, from our foreign partners, as well as from our active and very vibrant civil society that we do have in Ukraine. And as it was mentioned, Ukraine is going right now through a very serious period of transition. We have elected the new president, who still is to be inaugurated. And the Russian Federation's attack on Ukraine is also being continued. And unfortunately, Ukraine is not immune to populism. So notwithstanding all of these different tendencies, we are remaining committed to integration with the West, with the countries that care about freedom and about human rights and about equality. And for us, it's important that the West keeps Ukraine on its radar screen, that Ukraine gets the full support of and assistance of the partners. And yes, Ukrainian people do care and do demand further changes. And these changes still foresee the striving to fully overcome the Soviet legacy that we've been part of, and to get cut the umbilical cord of the grip of the Ruski Mir, of the Russian world that we have been experiencing up to date. The security situation is not getting any easier, unfortunately. The security does remain intense. Russia never stops trying and testing our defense and resilience and national unity. Unfortunately, people are being killed and wounded in Donbass, and this is happening every single day. There is no frozen conflict. There is no ceasefire that we would be happy with. And at this same time, we see some of the voices of the leaders of the Western world seeking rapprochement with the Russian Federation. Let me tell you, we in Ukraine believe there is no possible rapprochement with Russia unless Russia not only recognizes but provides for Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and full sovereignty. Vladimir Putin is talking. Thank you. Vladimir Putin is talking about possibility to reset relations with Ukraine after the presidential elections. But we do know what kind of reset he does mean. It's about dominance that Russia always cared about. And that reminds me of a very abusive relationship that we have seen across the board in different countries, in different families. So for a long time, we in Ukraine, we have had the dependency relationship with Russia. And this relationship was accompanied by continuous quote and unquote domestic violence. Even the divorce of 1991, when we break away, when the Soviet Union has fallen apart, it didn't help. And when we finally determined to actually stop the unproductive ties, our ex, he decided to punish us. And just like an alcoholic husband, every time he beats us, he actually says it was not me, and afterwards. So Ukraine has decided for itself that it will not remain a victim of the geopolitical violence, that Ukraine has, as any other sovereign nation, the right to choose its future, to choose its path. And we have already tasted freedom, and we know that this freedom cannot be defined from Ukrainian people. We are hoping for the strong voice of our friends on both sides of the Atlantic to guarantee that the aggressor will face responsibility for its actions. And we in Ukraine will pursue the country that deserves its freedom, its democracy, human rights being protected and respected, and deserves equality. Thank you very much.
Please welcome NDI Board Member Maureen White.
Technology actually is not helping me today. All right, good afternoon. I'm honored to once again have the opportunity to share a few thoughts on the leader of this great organization, NDI. As I have reflected on this year's theme, Risk Takers for Women's Empowerment, I've been thinking about the inherent dissonance between the ideas of risk and reward, concepts that are sometimes linked, but often in politics, it's hard to see the connection. Our country today is fraught with risks, more risks in some ways than we've ever seen. Risk to our immediate security from trouble spots around the globe, risk to our long-term security from a lack of seriousness about long-term problems like climate change, and of course, indeed, risk to our own republic, home, every day. Tragically, these risks hold no sign of reward. They're risks we endure as a result of poisoning cynicism, rising political alienation, and growing inequality in our society. And sometimes when these dangers overwhelm us, we are tempted to shy away from the challenges, to respond by being risk-averse, to dampen expressions of our core values, lest we add to the discord in the world. But the story of Madeleine Albright has taught us that that is a false choice. For to take no risks in defense of our ideals is to risk everything that we hold dear. Madeleine has shown us that we must be clear-eyed and courageous in pursuit of our values. It is only by taking risks that respect the strength of our shared ideals that we can yield the rewards for a better world. And that is the story of Madeleine Albright's life. From her family's escape from the Nazis to her service as the first female Secretary of State in the United States. And beyond that, she has never, ever flinched. In an international security environment dominated by men, often when she was the only woman in the room, she spoke truth to power. From her muscular advocacy for intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo, to her opposition to Boutros Boutros-Ghali's second term, to her support for assertive multilateralism, to her fight for the expansion of NATO. These were tough calls, which carried political and sometimes military risks. But grounded in her values, she carried them out with tenacity, focus, and vigor. And those decisions yielded significant rewards in the advancement of American interests and in universal human rights. Madeleine has brought those same qualities to the private sector, to academia, and to advocacy. She has inspired and empowered so many women who followed her into those fields, including the trailblazing congresswomen we saw earlier today. And she has brought those values to NDI, which now works in 7 countries to ensure that democracy lives and grows. And one of the ways it does so is by advancing the participation of women. As Madeleine has said, women's political power is not merely a goal, it's the cornerstone of democratic growth. It's my great honor to stand with the woman that we have recognized today and with all of you as we seek to follow Madeleine's courageous example. So please join me in welcoming one of our country's most respected risk-taker for women's empowerment and betterment of our world, Secretary Madeleine Albright.
I have been able to introduce you. Hello. Maureen, thank you very much for introducing me, and it's always great to have a really good friend tell the story. Thank you. Distinguished guests and fellow board members and members of the Parhamovich family and NDI supporters and friends, good afternoon to everybody. I am truly delighted to be here, and I want to thank our new president, Derek Mitchell, and Sherry Bryan, and Sandra Pepper, and James Vanderklok, and the outstanding NDI team for all the work that was put into today. And I also want to thank all of our very generous supporters for your belief in NDI's mission, which is today more important than ever. I also want to say thank you to Ken Wallach, who is here with us today, who has brought NDI to what it is. Thank you very much, Ken. This luncheon is always one of my favorite events, and that has nothing at all to do with its name. Rather, it's because each year we get to hear from celebrated and talented and courageous kick-ass women. And I can think that we can all agree that this has already been one of our best gatherings. The members of the record-breaking class of 2018 have brought new energy and new perspectives to Washington, and I'm so delighted that we got to hear from Representatives Haaland and Spanberger, and I thank them for coming and for the difference that they are making every day on our behalf. And Madam Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much for your remarks and your leadership in a country that is very dear to all of us. And you gave me this pin in Ukrainian, the women fighting there. So thank you very much. As Secretary of State, I designated Ukraine as one of the 5 countries that were most important to the success of democracy globally. But its importance is even more magnified today, 5 years after Russia's invasion of Crimea and the East. And we need to do everything possible to support the Ukrainian people, and I'm proud of the work that NDI is doing on the ground to help strengthen their democratic institutions. You heard earlier about the establishment of the new Disrupt Her coalition, and I'm delighted that NDI is partnering on this important new initiative, which will open new pathways to civic leadership for girls and young women. And you also heard the theme of this year's luncheon is celebrating risk takers for women's empowerment. Although I never ran for public office, which is something I truly regret because I was not sure that anybody would like me, as a public servant, I was no stranger to risk. So during the Clinton administration, I dealt with many risks, but 2 stick out in my mind. The first was a wardrobe crisis. In May 1997, we were at a meeting in Paris celebrating NATO, and I was talking to the foreign minister sitting next to me, and I noticed all of a sudden that I had spilled salad dressing all over my skirt. At which point, somebody came up and said, "We are going to have a family picture, and since you're the only woman, you're going to stand in the middle." So I thought, what am I going to do? So I had this brilliant idea that I would get up. Well, at first I tested to see that the waistband was loose enough that I would get up and turn my skirt around. The risk was that the slit up the back was higher than it should be. Anyway, it worked. And by the way, Henry Kissinger couldn't have done that. The second risk was obviously much more serious and consequential and involved issues of war and peace in Kosovo. These events have been on my mind because they unfold 20 years this spring. And let me briefly put some context on it. In 1998, violence had erupted in what was then the Yugoslav province of Kosovo between ethnic Albanians who were eager to assert their rights and the Serbs who saw the province as a key to their own identity and history. For months, we tried to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Ultimately, the Albanians said yes, but the Serbs said no, and began massing troops in preparation for an attack. Their plan, according to the information that we had, was to kill or drive out the Albanian population through a campaign of ethnic cleansing and terror. With Russia wielding a veto over any action by the Security Council, I argued that NATO should act, and President Clinton agreed, and so did our allies. The night before the hostilities began on March 23rd, the president called me the same time he usually did, around 1 a.m., because he never slept and didn't think anybody else needed to. And he said, "We're doing the right thing, right?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. President, we are." And so, incredibly hard as it was, we sent armed American forces into harm's way. We knew it was necessary, but we couldn't know how it would turn out. And as it happened, the early days were brutal. Milosevic's thugs swarmed into Kosovo and began burning villages and murdering civilians. And for the first time since World War II, we saw horrible pictures of people in Europe being loaded into trains like cattle. But the weather was bad, so many of our planes couldn't fly. And then the Serbs put out various decoys. And then on May 7th, 1999, 20 years ago, just yesterday, I came into my office and my executive assistant said, "Sit down." I said, "What's the matter with you?" He said, "Just sit down." As I said, "Really?" He said, "Sit down." I said, "What is the matter?" And he said, "We just bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade by mistake." By that time, the critics were out in force and pouring from all directions. And at that point, they did call it Madeleine's War. Then, when I started telling friends that the reason I looked fatter was that I had grown thicker skin. Through it all, the president was remarkably steady, and so was our team. And we all worked feverishly to keep the alliance together. In time, the weather improved and our airstrikes became effective. And finally, Milosevic had no alternative but to yield. His troops departed, and more than 1 million Kosovo refugees were able to return home. I was very proud soon thereafter to go to Pristina, the capital, to visit and to hear chants of gratitude for NATO and USA, USA, USA. And I was equally proud when in the spring of 2011, an independent Kosovo elected its first female president. Kosovo today remains a place of testing for democracy, and that's why I'm proud that NDI is on the ground, as we are in more than 60 countries helping to support peace, democracy, and women's empowerment. These efforts do continue to face stiff headwinds, not only in Kosovo, but around the world. By the way, I have to say, they didn't call it Madeleine's War when we won, but the thing that happened was there is a whole generation of little girls in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine. At our luncheon today, we've celebrated women who are going somewhere, and all of them have risked their personal and professional reputations for the betterment of others. And it is now my pleasure to honor another great risk taker. At NDI, we know that democracy is sustainable only when women do play a leadership role in the economic and political life of a country, just as the Vice Prime Minister said. We agree on many, many things, and that is definitely it. And we know that women's activism has been essential to positive social change, not only in the developing world, but right here in the United States. Few women in recent years have transformed American society as much as our honoree, Tarana Burke. For more than 25 years, Ms. Burke has worked at the intersection of racial justice, arts and culture, and sexual violence, creating and leading campaigns focused on increasing access to resources and support for underserved communities. Ms. Burke's fight against inequality started early in her life, and as a young girl growing up in the Bronx, she began organizing around issues of racial discrimination, housing inequality, and economic justice. In college, she organized and advocated on behalf of equal voting rights for all, and in 2003, she co-founded Just Be Incorporated, an organization committed to the leadership, development, and wellness of Black girls. After far too many encounters with young people whose lives were affected by sexual violence, she realized how many were suffering through abuse without access to resources, safe spaces, and support. The movement she founded was born out of the need to fill that void. In 2006, she began working with students using Me Too as a tool for healing, education, and action. In the years following, the Me Too movement quickly expanded beyond young people to include all marginalized groups. As Tarana says, Me Too is not a women's movement, and indeed, just as all groups are affected by sexual violence, this movement depends on allies from all sectors of society to uphold its commitment to creating the world we all want, one in which no person lives in constant fear of harm from another for speaking truth about past experiences. I deeply admire Tarana Burke's courage and her willingness to take risks on behalf of values that are fundamental to NDI's mission, and so I'm pleased to ask you to join me in welcoming her as the recipient of NDI's 2019 Madeleine K. Albright Award. Okay, can you take that? Okay.
Thank you so much. Sure, thank you. I've been sitting in my seat nervously for the past 30 minutes because I don't have prepared remarks. I've had a really rough 24 hours, and but I knew it was important for me to be here. And so instead, I want to tell you a story about risk. In 1996, I had just finished college, and I went to work for the organization that essentially shaped me as an organizer, taught me everything I knew about politics and about community organizing and so much about life. It's called the 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement. And as a part of that organization, we had a camp that we held every year where we had young people come from around the country. And I had been coming to that camp since I was 14. And now at 22, I was running the camp. That summer, I met a little girl who I call Heaven publicly. And Heaven was about 12 or 13. She was new to our camp, and she was new to our rules. And she was, in many ways, what we call in the South, a hellion. She was a handful, and I spent a lot of time that summer creating a relationship with Heaven, holding her really close to me, giving her lots of stuff to do, trying to sort of bring her into the fold. We have a session that we call Sister to Sister every year, where the girls are separated and they get to talk about anything they want. It's open and it's free and it's no judgment, and they tell all kinds of stories and they ask all kinds of questions of the counselors. But every year, almost like clockwork, it happened when I was a young person, at some point in the night, the conversation shifts, and because some young person will disclose about their experience with sexual violence. And part of that is because it's a safe space, and it's a space where the young people feel protected enough to talk about it. This year, when I was in the program, I didn't talk about what happened to me. I come from a Caribbean family where there are very clear, unspoken rules that say our business is our business. And so as much as I felt safe in that place, I never felt compelled enough to tell my story. But I would, console my friends and listen to them and do what I could to support them. And so this year, I watched heaven become me in that space. And I watched her listen to the girls as they talked about their experiences, and I watched her try to figure out if this is a place where she should insert herself, and I watched the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out if she should tell her story or not. I could feel her story on the tip of her tongue, but she never said anything. And then the following day, she found me very early in the morning and demanded to speak to me. She said, "Ms. T, I have to talk to you." But I knew what she was coming to tell me, and I really did not have the space for it. I was young, and I had not really come to grips with the things that I experienced as a young person. And so I ran from her for most of the day. But this child kept after me. And finally, she cornered me and said, "Ms. T, I have to talk to you." And she didn't know what I was going to say. She didn't know how I was going to respond. But she definitely risked it all to tell me what had happened to her at the hands of her mother's boyfriend. And I listened for as long as I could. And when I couldn't listen anymore, I sent her off to another counselor and said, "I can't help you." And I watched the disappointment in her face. But I still couldn't tell her anything different. Because the whole time she was telling her story, my mind was racing, saying, I don't know what to say. I'm not a counselor, and I'm not a therapist. I don't want to say the wrong thing. But what was coming up in my spirit was, this happened to me too. This thing that she was describing, not exactly the same way, not by the same people, but this thing had happened to me too. And I wanted so badly to share that with her, but I didn't take the risk. I'm often accused of courage. I'm often told how courageous I am to stand up, but when I think about taking risks, I think about children like Heaven, who really risked it all to tell me something that she had been holding in her body for God knows how many years. And because she took that risk, even though I didn't respond in the moment, I did make a commitment that I was going to figure out what my response should be. And I was going to start with figuring out how to deal with my own stuff so that it didn't become a hindrance when this moment came again. And in a few years after that, when we started this organization, I met more and more girls who took the same risk, who came to me and told me the things that were happening to them in all kinds of ways, or they didn't tell me, and I recognized the violence that was happening in their lives. And so then I took a risk to go to my community and say, we have to do something about this. This can't be right. Yes, we have to deal with these individual girls and their needs individually as survivors, but what do we do with hundreds of children in our community who are experiencing sexual violence? How do we not have a community response? What I always understood from the people who taught me to stand up for justice is that individual risk has to be met with collective courage. These children, these young people who stood up are no different than the millions and millions of people who stood up almost 2 years ago to say Me Too. We don't recognize the risk that it takes to disclose. Even if you're sitting behind your computer and typing out 2 words. I'm sorry. Yesterday, my stepfather was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. He's going to die. We don't know how long we have, but we know what the fate is. And it keeps making me think about time. So many people stood up and said "Me Too" 2 years ago, and we have really paid them no attention. This movement has ballooned into a global phenomenon on the backs of people who survive sexual violence. It is our labor that makes this word, these 2 words, household name. Thank you. We cannot waste time on distractions. We've never had a moment in this country where everybody paid so much attention to sexual violence. And I don't know how long it's going to last, but I know that while it lasts, we cannot waste time. For every single person who stood up and took the risk of saying "Me Too," we have to meet them with our collective courage. And that courage can show up in so many ways. You don't have to be on the front lines. You don't have to dedicate your whole life to it, but you do have to be dedicated to what we need to shift a culture that allows sexual violence to be as pervasive as it is. We should be asking questions about the lives of the individuals who said "Me Too," not about the livelihood of the people who've been accused. Until we are committed to changing this permissive culture that allows sexual violence to be so rampant, we will not see an end to this violence, but I do know that it's possible. And I'm not just optimistic. I believe with every fiber of my being that it is possible because I've seen culture shift before. I've seen what happens when we come together collectively and make up our mind that we will not stand for a thing. People who look like me are free in this country because of it. Women vote in this country because of it. I'm just asking people to take the risk with me. I don't need to be rewarded for risk. I need people to join me on the front lines and make a commitment to figure out what risk looks like in your life. Don't let these people who raised their hands so bravely 2 years ago continue to have their hands raised without having a response to it. So, I don't have anything else to say. I'm sorry.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon.